So the bishops invited me to open us with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Almighty God, you have given all of us the responsibility for the leadership of the church for a season. Grant us patience, courage, and wisdom to discern your will amidst the many competing claims and conflicts of this present time. Give us an appreciative memory for all who have gone before and a strong, clear vision of the church of the future. Let us exercise our stewardship with energy and enthusiasm so that when the time comes, we may faithfully relinquish our tasks to those who will come after. We ask this in the name of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, who calls us into fellowship and sends the Holy Spirit to guide and inspire us generation after generation, that we may do all in your greater glory. Amen. That opening prayer was from a woman by the name of Dr. Pamela Chinnis, who was a very well-known laywoman in the Episcopal Church, and at one time was held the title of President of the House of Deputies, which you are going to learn tonight. And so we did a prayer for the leadership of the church, because tonight we're going to talk about structure and governance and polity. And this is like one of the bishop's favorite topics. He loves history, he loves talking about liturgy and prayer, but he also likes to talk about church structure, and he's really good at it. So, and recognizing that the way we organize ourselves is one of the ways we live into our mission. So, Bishop Jose, you are up.
Thank you, Canon Augusta. Good to see you all this evening. I knew we'd have a smaller class, having to bump it into the night before Ash Wednesday. I knew that we would have a smaller class because a lot of congregations are doing a variety of virtual gatherings. I've seen everything from virtual pancakes to a talent show that St. Albans likes to do out in Hickory. And I see that the cathedral is doing a grab your griddle, and they're going to do a competition online while you're making your pancakes together as a church. So a lot of creative stuff is happening, and so I'm grateful for those of you who are with us. This may not be as rushed because this is one of those things that, kind of zeroed in on some particular areas. But still, some of what we're going to talk about tonight, there is a little bit of repeat from last week. Not so much that it's detailed repeat, but some because of some of the players we talked about in history, especially in the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church, are going to come back tonight. So let's talk about the Episcopal Church, sort of where we came from and how we got here, but then also to help us understand how we're structured and why we are the way we are. So the Episcopal Church is a result of English colonization, and of course the English people bringing their church to the colonies. Now, as a reminder, we talked about this last week, the Anglican tradition, 19th century under King Edward I, the boy king, the one who really was handled by people around him. And so a lot of that movement away from Catholicism even more was really with the people around Edward and not Edward himself. But it's then under Queen Elizabeth I, which brought the English Reformation to a conclusion. The Revolution of 1559, to end the religious turmoil that had been happening during Henry VIII, Edward, and Mary. So now with Queen Elizabeth, we're having this kind of coming to a conclusion. And so it's important to know that in 1558, you may have heard about it, and it was mentioned before, the Act of Supremacy, which once again, it reestablished the Church of England's independence from Rome. And Elizabeth I was given the title Supreme Governor of the Church of England. So let's talk about the Anglican reformers. They chose that middle way. Who we are today is because they chose that middle way between the Roman Catholicism and the various forms of Protestantism, which developed in Europe at that time. And there were two main stages in the spread of Anglicanism. The the first in the 17th century during the colonization of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And then the second stage began in the 18th century when missionaries traveled to Asia, Africa, and South America to spread the gospel and establish churches. So leading up to and during the early period of the Revolution, clergy were really in a tough spot. In the prayer book of the day, there were prayers for the king. The exact words of the prayer were to beseeching God to be his defender and keeper, giving him victory over all his enemies. That was in the prayers of the prayer book. Not to mention, you may not know this, that during the ordination service, part of the service, clergy had to swear their allegiance to the king. And so loyalty to the king, the flip side, the loyalty to the king and Church of England could be seen as treason to the American cause. And so in addition, in some regions of the colonies, many of the clergy received their stipend from England. So the question that you need to ask is, what would you do in that position? Well, some clergy fled. Went to England or Canada, and others took a huge risk and sided with the revolution. Interesting to note, more laity in the church were patriots, more loyal to the American cause than they were loyalists to the English crown. And so it's an interesting thing to know that Anglican lay people were 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. An interesting fact to know, because as you may or may not know, more Episcopalians have sat in the Oval Office than any other denomination. And a lot of that stems from the beginning of our nation. So following the American Revolution, these were sort of the emerging thoughts. How do we organize now that the war is over? And then how do we maintain this connection to the value of apostolic succession? Remember, we talked about this uninterrupted transfer of authority from the apostles down to present time of popes and bishops. So how do we maintain connection to the value of apostolic succession and the authority of bishops, but also value the role and authority of laity and baptism? So clergymen by the name of William Smith in Maryland gathered clergy in his region beginning in 1780. And for the next 3 years, they met to discuss these issues. And Smith actually helped design the initial founding process, which was then replicated in other states. So choosing a name, the Protestant Episcopal Church. And that was to distinguish it from Roman Catholics and their bishops, and distinguish from Congregationalists. Planned and gathered for an official state convention, which exercised authority over the affiliation of Episcopal churches in the state. You had to draft a charter because they had to get state approval to get title to the land. Because remember, this had been previously owned by the Church of England. So imagine that whole title and land process that had to go on. And then you had to get recognition as a new denomination, fully independent from any foreign church, any foreign power. You had to elect a priest to become a bishop, and then have the discussion of each state essentially becoming a diocese. So in 1785, you had the creation of a constitution and canons. Again, another little important to note is we talked about the number of people who were signers to the Declaration of Independence. Our constitution and canons were drafted by some of the same people who drafted the U.S. Constitution, and utilized some of that same overall format. Now, I could take a moment and make a little snarky comment and say, well, maybe that's why there's this wonderful inherent dysfunction at times when it comes to governance of a country and governance of a church. It's not perfect, but you will see these influences make its way into the church. So let's start, sort of the background here about what's going on. So let's start with New England colonies and states. They were surrounded by established state church. which is essentially was the Congregationalists. Very few Catholics at that time. And Anglicans in this region, while following the same process, believed the essential nature of the church was derived from the historic episcopate. And they placed tremendous authority in the episcopate to ordain clergy and to confer the gift of the Holy Spirit at confirmation. So again, in the New England colonies, you had this approach, this understanding that there was this tremendous emphasis on the historic episcopate. The Diocese of Connecticut gathered, which, let's be honest, it was 10 clergy. That's a convention we can work with. The Diocese of Connecticut had 10 clergy, and they elected Samuel Seabury as bishop in 1783. Interesting to note that he was actually the second choice. The first choice refused because of health issues. Now, here's another little interesting tidbit if you study Samuel Seabury. Remember what we talked about, sort of this idea of breaking away from this foreign power and this reign and a different emphasis. It's interesting to note that actually Samuel Seabury was a very devoted loyalist. Matter of fact, if you want some interesting reading, there are 3 letters he wrote. They are known sort of as the farmer's letters. And the pen name that he used in all of them was A.W. Farmer, which essentially stood for a Westchester farmer. And these letters were huge arguments for the loyalist claim, huge support to the crown. And interesting, a little bit of tie of our church in this early day is who was the person who responded to each of those letters with a lot of fervor? Someone by the name of Alexander Hamilton. And so you had this cleric under a pen name during the time of the Revolution, penning these incredibly strong cases for the loyalist claim and cause. He was arrested in 1775 by local patriots and kept in a prison for about 6 weeks. Now it's interesting. So that's obviously prior, because remember, in 1783, you have this election where he's elected. So when he goes to England in 1783, for the first time, he actually claims that those were letters he wrote. Whereas up until that point, he had not. And there had been some suspicion, but it was not certain who wrote those letters. But when he went to get ordained in 1783, he then claimed them. So maybe he wanted to come clean, I guess, before he was ordained. So in any event, let's go back then. So he's elected in 1783. He goes to England. And then knowing that bishops in England would not be able to consecrate him because there was at that point no parliamentary resolution that was passed that allowed it. And there were actually clergy already there that were kind of waiting for several years. And Seabury said, I'm not sticking around. So Seabury went to Scotland. And that's where he was consecrated. So that's why you have this tie to the church in Scotland, and why, as I talked a little bit about last week, that shield of the Episcopal Church, the blue shield, is the St. Andrew's cross with the blue, to have our tie that there was the church in Scotland that consecrated our first bishop. So he ends up going to Scotland, he gets consecrated, and then when he returns, he gathered only clergy from New England and did not include any laity in any of the regional conventions for 5 years. So from 1784 to 1789, he simply gathers the clergy. Now, meanwhile, we focus and we shift to the southern and middle colonies, and that was a whole different approach. So in the southern and middle colonies, they valued the voluntary association of churches. and they placed a lot more authority in representative convention of laity and clergy. And so in that part of this new nation that was burning, bishops were valued more for their connection to the apostolic succession and authority to ordain clergy, and really not much else. And they also worked really hard to de-emphasize other traditions. For instance, not use the word priest. And so for those of us who went to seminary in Virginia, for instance, Virginia Theological Seminary, including Canon Augusta, there's always this joke because in New York, General Theological Seminary, VTS and General were the two oldest. There was always this sort of, joke from people in general that the people who went to Virginia Theological probably didn't know what a chasuble was. They probably didn't know what vestments. And it's true, for a long time, there weren't candles on the altar and all sorts of things. So this kind of conversation, when you've heard people talk about low church, you had a very different emphasis. So again, there was a much more emphasis on that shared ministry and laity. It reflected the regional Baptist congregational traditions, which in fact had higher value of laity and a much lower value of bishops. And also, quite frankly, they were trying to distance themselves from the Roman Catholic Church, this sense of authority of a church that's dominated by bishops. So in the meantime, most dioceses elected a presiding priest to serve as an overseer of the diocese until clergy could be consecrated bishop by the Church of England, which was, as we mentioned earlier, was in the process of passing parliamentary legislation that would allow it. So one of the most influential, we mentioned a little bit about him last week, was William White. If you remember talking last time, William White was a chaplain in the US Senate. He had come from actually a very prominent family. But he wrote a pamphlet that it's entitled "The Case of the Episcopal Churches in the United States Considered," which essentially laid out the foundation. It laid out the early thinking for the emerging Episcopal Church. And so among some of the innovations he proposed, and which were actually eventually adopted, was including lay people in the church's decision-making bodies. So these southern and middle states also adapted the process developed by Smith earlier on, but then added two additional provisions in '84, that each diocese would participate in the first General Convention of all dioceses in 1785. And then each diocese adopted a resolution that the General Convention would be unicameral, would be a one body, get this, where bishops are ex officio members and the representative clergy and laity are voting members by orders. So again, and we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later, the role of bishops and how this still kind of plays itself out today in some of the governance. So again, this competing sort of sense about bishops. And again, if you spent all these years fighting a government that you don't feel represents you and is somewhere else, you kind of have a problem with authority. And so if you're part of the Church of England and everything with the bishops and this loyalty and this sense that the king is part of your liturgy, you can probably understand why there's this resentment to this authority and why, in fact, you would not want to have anything that reeks similar to what they had. Again, very much mimicking what the nation had been experiencing and what the nation was trying to declare in its independence. So in 1785 and 1786, representatives of 7 states gathered, each having participated in the process I laid out. And 7, because New England states did not attend. They wanted to kind of pursue their own different organizational plans. So at these first general conventions, they met in Philadelphia. They drafted and ratified a constitution. The overall sort of big picture establishment of the Episcopal Church, again, still with the emphasis of a unicameral gathering. And then they prepared a proposed Book of Common Prayer. So now, 1785, the Diocese of Pennsylvania elects William White to be bishop. And the Diocese of New York elects Samuel Provoost to be bishop. So in 1786, Parliament passed legislation providing for the consecration of 3 bishops from the American Church, which is what is needed to consecrate a bishop. So White and Provus were consecrated in England. They were both consecrated on the same day, February 4th, 1787. They were consecrated in Lambeth Palace Chapel by the Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, the Archbishop of York, and the Bishop of Bath and Wales. The third priest, this is another little interesting side story. The third American priest to be consecrated was a bishop by the name of James Madison, not the president. And he was elected in 1790. Now, again, he wasn't the original. So remember, there was going to be 3. A gentleman by the name of David Griffith was elected to be that third, and to go along with William White and Samuel Provoost to be that third bishop. But he couldn't raise the money. He couldn't raise the money necessary to travel to England. So he ends up resigning his election, and then you have James Madison, who's then ordained a consecrated bishop in 1790. So now that sets the stage for 1789, the General Convention. So representative clergy from 9 dioceses. And so if you look again at the Episcopal Church shield that I told you about, and you see in that upper left quadrant the St. Andrew's Cross, the St. Andrew's Cross is made up of 9 smaller crosses. And that's to represent those first 9 dioceses, which made this General Convention of 1789. Maryland, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. So representative clergy from those 9 dioceses in 1789 meet in Philadelphia for what is now understood in our church as the first official General Convention, because it now included all the dioceses in the United States, including the diocese from New England, Massachusetts, that, remember I said earlier, wasn't part of those early gatherings. So the full name that was established at that point was the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America. It wasn't actually until 1979 at the 66th, I think it's the 66th convention. Canon Augusta can do the fact checking on that if I'm wrong. In 79, it's when it gets the name the Episcopal Church. But how many of you think that that's the official legal name of the Episcopal Church? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. I was going to say there's no wrong answers, but there is. But let's play along here. So here's a true fact, and this is what confuses people. And when people see this, this is where they get confused. So actually, the official legal name, the corporate name of our church, is actually the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. How's that to have on your business card? That is actually the full legal name, and you will often see, if you get any sort of mailers or electronic newsletters from the Episcopal Church, you will often see references to DFMS. And as bishops, we often get that, and we get communication or we get documents, and it says DFMS. And DFMS is because in a lot of our documents, it has to use that legal name, the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. So interesting, and that was incorporated as part of the New York legislature in 1821 because the Episcopal Church is headquartered, if you will, in New York. So again, the original name in 1789 was the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America, wanting to be very clear about this break-off in this new nation. But it wasn't until 1979 that we actually shrunk it to say the Episcopal Church. But yet legally, we have this mouthful. Again, good information to know. So when you're at your next Episcopal party and you have a party full of Episcopalians, you can say, hey, does anybody know the full legal name? And you'll be the hero and the star. What they did in 1789, another important step. So remember, up until this point, there is a unicameral, a one body. So in 1789, they amend the initial constitution of 1785. And they essentially blend those two major philosophies and ecclesiologies, the ones I was talking about from the New England states, those from the middle southern states. And mainly, the biggest change was that the General Convention would be a bicameral convention system. A House of Deputies and a House of Bishops. House of Deputies containing laity and clergy, and the House of Bishops, including bishops. And importantly, they approved the official Book of Common Prayer, which was updated from the 1786 version. So you'll often see, and I don't have anything handy here, but you'll often see in publications when you see the official shield, or if you go to the General Convention website, or you'll see some of the Episcopal Church material, you'll see the shield, and you will see 1789 as a date. I think Canon Augustus grabbing. I think it's in the front of our Constitution and Canons. I think you have it in front of it. There you go. Do you see it? So it says 1789 as the date. So that's what we recognize as the church that we know today. Its beginning and its roots. So one thing to understand, because we throw that term around a lot, we are a hierarchical church. We do have, and what Canon Augusta just held up is our Constitution and Canons of the Episcopal Church, something that she's required, and so are bishops, to memorize, page by page and paragraph by paragraph. It lays out who we are, our structure. It lays out our understanding of ministry. So it's important to know that the Constitution, so you hear Constitution and Canons, the diocese has a Constitution and Canons. So the Constitution is the fundamental legal document of an institution. It essentially establishes its existence. It establishes its structures. It establishes its rules for governance. Whereas the canons are sort of those specific parts and rules of governance and policies. It's essentially the rule of law that's enacted by a convention that has to be in sync with the Constitution. This is really exciting conversation. But it's important because we throw that term around a lot. And so, because as bishops specifically, we have a responsibility to uphold the Constitution and Canons of the Episcopal Church. And it's kind of like, I jokingly say, it's kind of like the Dianetics book. You got a question? It's in there. Just go to one of those pages. It's there. So you have these interconnected instruments of unity and authority in the Episcopal Church. Of one is the Constitution and Canons. And so the document, the book that Augusta held up, that can only be changed and modified by General Convention. It must be in sync with both houses to pass any changes. So every 3 years, that book she's holding up is republished with any of the changes that occurred while we were at General Convention. So these instruments that we talk about in the Episcopal Church is the Constitution and Canons, that founding organizational document, and the Book of Common Prayer, which is authorized. Canon Augusta is holding it up in case you don't know what a Book of Common Prayer looks like. Everybody take a good look at it. So what's important to understand is that a lot of what we do and a lot of it's governed is also in the Book of Common Prayer. So in General Convention in 1801 adopts the revised 39 Articles of Religion, which we talked about last week, setting forth all our understanding of baptism, sin. If you want to know where we stand on sin, the sacraments. It even has a section in the 39 Articles on purgatory for all you former Catholics like me who want to read what we have to say about purgatory. It's all in there. And that's page 867, let's say. 867. Let's go with that. So Canon's Book of Common Prayer, and then those 39 articles of religion. Another part or instrument of unity and authority is the General Convention. It's that body that enacts legislation, amends canons. This is the representational body from every diocese in the Episcopal Church. And so between conventions, there is an executive council, just like there's a diocesan level, which we'll talk about. But the executive council oversees that mission of the church, and it's made up of clergy, priests, deacons, bishops, and laity from around the Episcopal Church, of which the presiding bishop is the president and chair. So between the conventions every 3 years, the executive council is that body then that acts as the overseer. So any changes or modifications to the budget that need to be done, is they're the ones that have that authority. And then bishops. That's another interconnected instrument of unity and authority in the Episcopal Church. So we have a House of Bishops. The House of Bishops, on a normal quote unquote year, we gather twice a year, the House of Bishops for a week, one in the spring and one in the fall. During the pandemic, we have still met, but we've met by Zoom. And so we have a House of Bishops meeting coming up in March over a 5-day period. It's broken out, obviously, because we can't be literally on a Zoom 5 days a week from morning till evening. But that's still happening. And that is a time when bishops gather for prayer, for study, to discuss issue, really for us to share and for us to deal with some of the same issues that we're all working through. And then normally in a year where there is a general convention, we don't meet twice because that's too much. So normally in a year where there's a general convention, the House of Bishops would meet in the spring, general conventions in the summer, and then we would not meet in the fall. And the way that presiding Bishop Curry has kind of set it up is that the spring meeting is much more about refreshment. It's a little bit less intense in its pace, although there's a lot of business and a lot of work we do. But the idea is to give bishops a little bit more intentional time for self-reflection, for conversation, kind of in a Lenten sort of feel. And then the fall is really where there's a lot of work. There's still obviously prayer and study and singing and worshiping, but there's more intentional work and a much more rapid pace in the fall. So from those instruments, we understand that the foundation of all authority in our church is rooted in baptism. So we believe, that equal and mutual authority is given to all through baptism. We believe the Holy Spirit is active in everyone's life. It gives each of us a unique gift, a unique and incomplete gift, and that it unites us into this larger whole. And, you can look to 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, the language of the various gifts that we all bring. So in our canons, Title 3, Canon 1, if you want to look it up, all baptized persons have a ministry. Again, a very important thing to understand as we get a little bit further. And so our theological understandings, this sense of the baptismal gift and the gifts that we share, is all found in our catechism, which is also in our prayer book. It's referred to and called, the outline of faith, which we now know as, the catechism, between pages 845 and 862. And it's an instructional summary and not a complete statement of belief. But again, part of what you have to understand with our prayer book and our constitution and canons, they're tied, they're connected. And so in the rubrics and in the teachings, a lot of the historic documents are found in the prayer book to really establish our understanding of who we are as the Episcopal Church, part of the larger Anglican Communion, and what we take and what we kept from the Church of England. So at the end of the day, we believe that the authority sits in the pews. The Episcopal Church has characteristics of a representative democracy, very unique in most parts of the Anglican Communion. So we exercise our authority through the election of representatives. So a vestry, we elect vestries in a parish. We elect delegates at the parish level to be delegates to the Diocesan Convention. And then at the Diocesan Convention, we elect people to be deputies to General Convention. So very much a representative democracy. And these individuals at the vestry level, convention level of the diocese, and at the general convention make decisions on our behalf. And so in our church, then, we also have bishops who exercise authority within that same framework. Shared leadership is a term we use all the time in our church. All of us have a role, different ones, but we all have a shared role in all matters. Well, most matters. We'll talk about that down the road. So again, we have bishops who exercise authority within that framework. And as I've said, this is a very uncommon approach to leadership in the Anglican Communion. And this is part of what often causes challenge when we talk about our work as Episcopalians, the Episcopal Church, as part of the larger Anglican Communion. And when we get down to talking about the communion and the Episcopal Church, I'll say a little bit more about that. But again, looking at our roots, looking at what we struggled with and what we continue to struggle with, looking at the issues that continue to present themselves to our church, you can see how governance does matter when we get into these conversations and debates in the larger communion. So when you understand how we're organized and how we function, then you understand sort of why it's a little bit more complex. So polity in the parish, let's start there. Let's start with the people in the pews. People in the pews who elect the vestry and elect delegates to diocesan convention at the annual parish meeting. And so the vestry is responsible for most of the big decisions in the parish, as again described in the Constitution and canons. Adult communicants in good standing, which is the term, invest some of that baptismal authority in the vestry. So a side note, because this is the question that often perplexes church leaders and clergy. Title I of the canons, Section 2, and so I'm a little hesitant. I know it's Title I, I believe it's Section 2, and again, Augusta will clarify if I'm wrong. So here's what they say. All members of this church who have received Holy Communion in the church at least 3 times during the preceding year are to be considered communicants of this church. That's about it. And then, just so you know, and I said this last week, but I was wrong because I was getting confused between state and the church. The church, for the purposes of the church, we in our Constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church, we state that communicants, adult communicants, is anybody 16 years of age or over are to be considered adults. I know some of us are thinking about what our children were like at 16, but yes, there are communicants, adult communicants at 16 years of age or over. So the vestry receives that authority to make decisions on behalf of the congregation. Parish invests some of that same authority by electing delegates to our annual diocesan convention. So that kind of moves us to how the polity works in the diocese. So every parish is represented by their elected delegates and clergy. So all clergy, good standing, are automatic members to the diocesan convention, and then the delegates that are elected from each parish. So at diocesan convention, what only the convention can do is pass a diocesan budget. It can't be done by me and a fiscal ministry or standing committee or executive council. It has to be passed by a diocese. Matter of fact, one of the interesting issues we had to wrestle with in the age of the pandemic was making sure that legally we could conduct a diocesan convention electronically and that it would satisfy the canons and constitutions. And believe it or not, there was a series of meetings between bishops and chancellors to make sure that we were okay in being able to conduct business. So we have to pass a diocesan budget and only can be done at convention. You have to elect leaders of the diocese, standing committee members, members of the executive council, diocesan trustees. So that's done at convention. And then setting policy and any changes to our canons can only be done at the diocesan convention. I can't change policy. I can't change canon to something that I prefer or even take out a small sentence or a language. I can't do any of that. That has to actually be done by the full convention. And then every 3 years, as part of our role in the larger polity, the diocese has to elect deputies to General Convention. 4 lay, 4 clergy is who we elect. And the Diocesan Convention is the only body that can elect a bishop diocesan or a bishop suffragan, an elected assistant, essentially. That has to be done in terms of Diocesan Convention. That's why often, like happens in this diocese, a special convention is held. It's not done usually in the context of a normal business. It's usually as a special diocesan convention. So it gets confusing because although we're part of a larger church and and the fact that a vestry is independent, there is still dependency on the other. There are still things in which we have to do in tandem. So on a diocesan level, we are independent to a degree. I can't function in another diocese except by invitation and permission. So here's an interesting little bit of trivia. When you see bishops go to other dioceses, or you see, like, for instance, the bishops that were at my consecration, you'll notice that there were only 2 bishops in that procession. If you were there or you were watching, there were only 2 bishops that were carrying croziers, shepherd's crooks, right? So who were the 2? I'm looking at the clergy to see if they're going to bail out the rest of the people. Cynthia, you're on mute.
Was it from Florida where you grew up? Nope.
Presiding Bishop,
What was that, Cynthia?
presiding Bishop Michael.
Right. And who was the other?
You.
You?
Who said that?
I think Augusta.
Excellent. No, it wasn't Augusta. You're right. So here's the thing. Because it's essentially a representation of the shepherd of that flock, only a diocesan bishop or the presiding bishop can carry a crozier within a diocese. So if you'll notice, all the other bishops who were there, none of them were carrying croziers. So if you'll notice that Bishop Porter walked in holding, and then when there was the consecration and turning over, it was only me carrying along with the presiding bishop, and Porter was no longer. It's a symbol, but it's part of that understanding that I just can't go over to East Tennessee or Georgia or Upper South Carolina and just say I'm the bishop. It's the same thing with clergy. Clergy just can't go into another diocese and function. That's part of this complicated part of how our church is designed and the ecclesiastical authority of bishops. So we can wear our crozier, we can wear our pointy hats in other dioceses because it's representative of the vocation we hold, but that crozier is representative of being the diocesan, or in the case of the presiding bishop, he is the shepherd of the entire flock of the Episcopal Church. So there you go. Another little interesting fact for those Episcopal parties you have. So the dioceses established their own constitution and canons. But here's the thing. We cannot violate or contradict the constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church. We can go further. So if the Episcopal Church has a particular area, we can always add more to ours, but we can't contradict it. And then we set our own budgets. We set our own mission initiatives. We set our own procedures and programs. And each individual bishop is responsible for the administration of that diocese and of the staff. So on the larger level of the church, you've got the House of Deputies that's elected by the president of the House of Deputies. So again, this bicameral body meets every 3 years. House of Deputies made up of clergy, mostly deacons and priests and lay people, 4 from each diocese, 4 clergy, 4 lay people. And so a House of Deputies president is elected just by the House of Deputies from among the deputies, but that president is confirmed by the House of Bishops. And then on the House of Bishops elect the presiding bishop. And we elect a presiding bishop from among our House of Bishops. And it's confirmed by the House of Deputies. So an interesting process, and this is all spelled out in the canons and constitutions of the Episcopal Church. There is a whole process as to how the search process is organized, the membership that is contained, and before the bishops can go into a closed session, and what usually happens is bishops go off property somewhere. They kind of basically get locked up. They could be in a local church or somewhere. They can't have phones. They can't have any electronic devices. Everything is taken from them. Doors are sealed. Nobody's in there except bishops. And so they have that process until they elect a presiding bishop. That name is then delivered and announced to the House of Deputies for then a confirmation vote. But here's the interesting part. Before the House of Bishops can go in to that sequestered gathering, there has to be a time of vetting and question and answer by the full General Convention, specifically the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies. And in the canons, it calls for a joint session. And because the House of Deputies is much larger, it's usually the bishops that then come into the House of Deputies and sit with our delegations. And so there is a presentation. There are a variety of summaries done by the nominating committee. No vote is taken or anything, but they're simply presented, and questions are fielded from the deputies and others that are gathered. At that point, then there is this vote where they go off. So it's a fascinating process. And so presiding bishops serve a 9-year term. They can be reelected, but here's the interesting part. For the first time in the history of the Episcopal Church was hit with a conundrum when Bishop Catherine Jetford Shorey finished her term. She was the first presiding bishop in our church that, because she was young enough, was eligible for a full second term as the presiding bishop. Nowhere in our canons and constitutions does it talk about a previous presiding bishop being eligible for another term. So there's nothing in there that says they can stay on. They're not automatically put to the slate. So it was really interesting because here we have somebody who was young enough that could serve another full 9 years. She ultimately decided she didn't want to run again. And so the church didn't have to go through that process, but it's then since been in the process of looking at language for the Constitution and canons of how you would deal with a sitting presiding bishop that would still be young enough, meaning not hitting the mandatory age of 72 years required of all clergy to retire. And so for the first time, the church had to say, if we've got somebody young enough and they could get another 9-year term and still not hit 72, what's the process? So that was a first and a unique thing for the Episcopal Church when we had that dilemma when the presiding bishop's term was up. And the other thing in canons is very clear. The nominating committee has to present at least 3 nominees. There can be no less than 3 nominees, and that's in the Constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church. So again, the House of Deputies, the House of Bishops, makes decisions for the Episcopal Church. And so it impacts, again, our canons. They pass the budget for the Episcopal Church. The interesting part about it is the process itself, and I talked a little bit about this, it's kind of challenging in that you've got 550 plus deputies, about 120 bishops. So you've got a lot of people having to make legislation and to do a lot of work. And because we're set up the way we are, the House of Bishops or the House of Deputies, either one can initiate any sort of legislation, but the final product must be voted on by both and agreed to by both. So often you see like a lot what happens on the Hill, and I spent a lot of years in Washington, you've got committees and you've got both sides marking up, making changes, making edits, sending it back. And there's this whole elaborate process that tracks it. And at General Convention, delegates and bishops are given iPads because there's hundreds of legislation that's going back and forth. And these iPads update the legislation to the second. So the only way you can keep track of this thing is as you're going through it and there's an amendment, it's automatically changed. And there's literally every day, there's legislation that's pending in each house. And you literally work your way down. And so it's a lot like sitting in the Capitol, if you've ever been in the gallery and watching some of this. It can be just as frustrating and annoying and angering and joyous and fun as you could possibly imagine. It has all those wonderful things because you're really seeing a democratic body really working through some challenging issues. And there have been times there have been some amazing moments in the midst of that, when we're talking about some of these incredible areas about marriage, about what we're going to do with issues in Israel. I mean, some amazing stuff happens. And that's why I would encourage all of you, and I said it before, if there's ever General Convention close to you or you can drive, they need so many volunteers. It is worth going to. It is worth going to and volunteering and being a part of this, or even better yet, run for election in the diocese to be a deputy to General Convention. It is, I joke about it, it can be frustrating, but it's also pretty remarkable of how we come together and do this kind of work from all over the church. So let's talk about the Anglican Communion because it gets a little bit more interesting. Let's do this. Can we do a 5-minute stretch break? Because I'm just recognizing the hour. 5-minute stretch break, and then we'll go into the Anglican Communion a bit. I'm going to give you sort of some key dates in our history that kind of have affected who we are. And then we're going to kind of leave it there and see if there's any questions or any closing stuff to address. How's that? Does that work? Okay. Back in 5. All right. Stretch. So I want to put up a couple things quick. First, I want to show you the Episcopal Church, our what we look like. Because we are divided in provinces. There are 9 provinces in the Episcopal Church. And so I don't know if you can see that. So we're in province 4, which is the largest of the provinces when it comes to population and number of dioceses. It's referred to as sort of the historic southern provinces, also referred to as the owning diocese of Sewanee, the University of the South. There are governing structures within each province. Essentially, a lay person and a bishop head up the province. And basically, it's just, it's not a formality in the sense that we do business, but it is in the sense that we do work, and often issues of the church are then discussed at provincial levels. And often people who are sent to province as representatives are usually the same people that go to General Convention. We do gather, we do have conversations throughout the year, we compare notes, we talk about strategies, we figure out ways to work together. We often will do programs together. There's a large Province 4 youth initiative that we do together. And so this gives you an idea of how we're organized. And the important thing is, I always correct people, we're not the national church. When they refer to sort of headquarters, we say the national church. We're not a national church, we're an international church. So the Episcopal Church is what we say is the Episcopal Church and not the national church, because Province 9 is made up of Colombia, Dominican Republic, the 2 dioceses in Ecuador, Honduras, Venezuela, Taiwan. And so we are international. Cuba, that just recently joined us, is not part of Province 9. They're part of Province 1. And the reason they're part of Province 1 is because they've had a historical affiliation to some of those dioceses there. And so they've are affiliated. But this just gives you an idea of that provincial structure. So the bishops in Province 4 were probably some of the more organized. We gather on a regular basis. We do have a lot of conversations together. And again, it's a historic thing, the large population. And then the next map I'll show you is to kind of lead off the way about the Anglican Communion. There's 45 provinces in the Anglican Communion. And you can Google this. I mean, they're all listed, and I dare anybody to be able to lean forward. But anything from, Anglican Church in, Australia, look at you, Pakistan, Wales, Brazil, Burundi, Canada, Ireland. So the Anglican Communion, of which we're a part of, represents 80 million people worldwide. So we are 80 million strong around the world. And so when you think of our church, you think not only beyond your own church, your own diocese, the Episcopal Church, but this is what we're part of the larger. And so the head of our church, the Anglican Communion, is the Archbishop of Canterbury. That is nominated by the Prime Minister of England and, in fact, selected and appointed by the monarch, in this case, the Queen. And so Justin Welby is our current Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the youngest we've had, actually. And so this is the larger representation of who we are. And I would encourage you can go to the Anglican Communion site and you can see all the churches and get more about it and get more details on Anglican Church and sort of the global priorities that we work together towards. Thank you, Canon Augusta. So I share that with you because we're part of something much larger and more complicated at times. And so our polities are different, how we came to be are different. And so part of that is to understand that the tie, if you will, the relationship is not diocesan. And this is what was a big issue during the time of Gene Robinson. The relationship of being in good standing with the Archbishop of Canterbury is bishop to bishop. So basically the idea being is that I can be in relationship with the Archbishop of Canterbury, even if there isn't a good relationship with the Episcopal Church, because my relationship does not depend on the relationship of the presiding bishop of this province. Because I am a bishop, duly elected, independent in this diocese, yet part of the larger Episcopal Church, yet part of the larger Anglican Communion. So it gets complicated because people will often say, well, if the Episcopal Church was, having issues with the Anglican Communion, then I guess the Diocese of Western North Carolina is on the outs. Well, on one side, we could say we are part of the larger Episcopal Church. But on the other, if I'm in good standing with the Archbishop of Canterbury, that's the relationship. So Lambeth is the gathering. Lambeth Palace is where the Archbishop of Canterbury lives in London. Canterbury Cathedral is the seat of the Archbishop. And so every 10 years, the Archbishop of Canterbury invites the bishops throughout the communion of every province to Lambeth for a gathering. It's been postponed. It was supposed to happen last summer, but because of COVID, it's now going to happen in 22. And you only get to go to Lambeth if you receive an invitation from the Archbishop. So I got this beautiful letter, nicely embossed with the Archbishop of Canterbury's seal, nicely hand signed and all that, addressed to me and my wife, and personally inviting us on behalf of him and his wife to attend Lambeth in England. And so part of the controversy is because if you remember, after Gene Robinson, there was a Lambeth, some people were invited and some weren't. And that was a huge issue because the Archbishop has to deal with maintaining the entire communion, and there was pressure put on him not to invite Gene Robinson. And then there was pressure put on him not to invite those churches or dioceses that have left the Episcopal Church. And so there was this position that the Archbishop of Canterbury got put in. And he ultimately did not invite Gene Robinson, even though Gene Robinson was a duly elected, confirmed bishop in New Hampshire. That caused then other bishops of the Episcopal Church to then decline their invitation and protest because he was a duly elected, confirmed bishop in the Episcopal Church as part of the Anglican Communion. That's the trickiness of it. And if the Archbishop of Canterbury didn't invite, he can't go. And so there was this question of why are some invited and some are not? And it's part of the larger theological debates that we have had within the communion. So as a result of the same-sex marriage conversation and decision on our part, there were decisions being made around that. And so I just share that with you because not for any statement, but just to tell you that that's sort of this balance. And so part of that conversation that happened back in Lambeth after Gene Robinson, the bishops who were all angry at Episcopal church bishops saying, just tell your people they can't have same-sex marriage and gay people can't be ordained, and let's just end it. And many of them couldn't understand that we just can't make those kinds of decisions exclusively as bishops. And so they had a hard time understanding our polity that the General Convention made a decision. So this is where it gets complicated because we're much more democratic. I don't have absolute authority. There are a lot of things as a bishop in the Episcopal Church I do, but in the wider Anglican Communion, a bishop in Africa, for instance, could say to a priest, you're done. You're no longer a priest. I pull you from that church. We don't have that kind of authority. I have to have cause, and there's a process to make sure that I'm not taking a priest and doing something to punish them. There's a process if there is something that's happened on their part. So it's because we share this authority among us. I'm making it kind of simplified, but it's just to give you an idea that it's a much more complex when it talks about the larger level. And essentially the four instruments of the communion we've talked about before, the four things that connect us as a larger is the Archbishop of Canterbury as that head of the Anglican Communion, the Lambeth Conference that brings all the bishops together from around the world, the Anglican Consultative Council, the ACC, which is kind of, if you will, kind of the Anglican Communion Vestry or Diocesan Council, made up of priests, deacons, lay people, and bishops from around the Anglican Communion. And then the other instruments of unity that we call ourselves that are interconnected as people of the Anglican Communion is the primates meeting. So all those 45 you saw on that map, so Bishop Curry is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church and the primate of the Episcopal Church. So he and the 45 of his colleagues gather, just like the House of Bishops do. So those are the four instruments of unity that we say that link us together, although we are different in our context of how we live out our faith and why you have this disparity of in some parts of the world, we ordain gay and lesbian people and we allow same-sex marriage, and in other parts of the communion they don't, or don't ordain women. And so that's the complicatedness of it. And we live in that tension that we hold this Anglican theology, this Anglican tradition in the context of where we are, and yet we're still connected. And the Archbishop does not have absolute authority over me or this church, nor does the presiding bishop in many ways. Again, there are exceptions. If there's a issue in this diocese of which charges are brought against me, then of course the presiding bishop is involved in that. But that's the tension here. That's the beauty of it, and that's the tension, is that we have this interconnectedness through these shared way of being, shared theology, prayer book, traditions, and these gatherings, and these ways in which we come together to do work. So that's kind of the beauty and the constant strain within the system. So let me tell you about just a couple of notable parts of history, moments in history that impact our governance. This is not exhaustive, but this is essentially some of the ones that I believe are the most important. Civil War. We talked about the Revolution, but the Civil War. When the American Civil War began in 1861, the Episcopalians in the South formed the Protestant Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America. However, it's important to note that in the North, the separation was never officially recognized. So ultimately, by May 16th of 1866, the Southern Diocese rejoined the larger church. But they did, in fact, form that and declared themselves that. So that was an important part, just like it was for the nation. That was an important part in the history and time of our church. Another one, slaves. We got to be honest. They were owned by many Episcopalians and directly and indirectly built many of the churches throughout the Episcopal Church. And it's important to note because I think as a church in these past years, we have come to more of a recognition and understanding and acknowledgement of the sacrifice that was made and the fact that we were part of that, that stain in our history. Clergy of color. Absalom Jones, which many of you have heard, founded the first Black Episcopal congregation in Philadelphia. Just had Absalom Jones celebration. It was the first Black Episcopal congregation founded in 1802 in Philadelphia, and he was the first African American to be ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church. That was in 1802. Bishops of color. A gentleman by the name of Samuel Ferguson was consecrated as bishop in 1885. And he became the first Black member of the House of Bishops. And he was elected to serve as the missionary bishop of Liberia. Again, another important part of our history, and that impacts who we are and later understanding and issues that we struggle with. Women to serve on vestries and delegates to General Convention. I don't know if you realize, but the first women admitted as delegates to the General Convention was in 1970. So it's not like it's something that's been a long time in our history. So that's an important note in our church, unlike many other churches, parts of the communion. Prayer book revisions obviously have influenced our governance and changes. The most notable, of course, being in 1979, which is our current prayer book, the 1979 prayer book. Ordination of women, another huge, and yet not completely accepted around the Anglican Communion. There was an irregular ordination, as it was called, because it wasn't approved at that point, in Philadelphia, 1974. The 11 women who are ordained are known affectionately as the Philadelphia 11. They took tremendous risk, and especially the bishops who ordained them. And there was talk that they were going to get, the bishops would be, in fact, sanctioned and potentially removed from the House of Bishops in the Episcopal Church. Interesting side note. So in 1976 is when it was officially adopted for the ordination of women. So 2 years prior, you had the Philadelphia 11. Philadelphia is always a center point, isn't it, for something? And that was intentional in many ways, too, obviously. Interesting note, 2 of those 11 retired in this diocese. Carter Haywood, who's in Brevard, and Alison Cheek, who's originally from Australia, also in Brevard, and sadly, she died in September of 19. Spent time with both of them. They're amazing. Alison Cheek was an unbelievable woman. But you can look them up and you can see and learn more about the Philadelphia 11. The first woman bishop, another important part of our church history, Barbara Harris in 1988, elected in Massachusetts. And I got to tell you, if you've ever met Barbara Harris, boy, talk about a pistol. If you ever want to read, I mean, she spoke her mind and she had no problem until the very end. And I remember the first time I met her, and I had a conversation with her. She was a avid smoker. She always had a cigarette in her hand. I mean, I don't know how many cigarettes she went through. And I remember seeing, Barbara Harris, the pioneer, the one who's so out there and says, and remarkably said a very huge comment at Lambeth that really put a lot of people on their knees. But I'll never forget my first conversation as a bishop with her at General Convention. And I said, this is so wonderful to be here. And I'm interested in, sort of on for you, you've been doing this for a while. And she's puffing on a cigarette outside the Starbucks. And she said, let me tell you something. And that's how she talked, right, Augusta? She had a deep voice. Let me tell you something. It's all crap. It's all crap. We just got to do the work of Jesus. That's all we got to do. This is all crap. And I thought to myself, what an amazing woman. I mean, who's done so much and been such an impact on this church. And she boiled it down. And she wasn't saying that she doesn't like it. She thinks that just basically saying it's about the work of Jesus. And that was one of those wonderful moments that I've ever had. And she was that's who she was to the end. Spoke her mind, spoke her piece. And so she made a tremendous impact in our church. And let me tell you something, up until the day she died, when we had the last time of gathering in House of Bishops, when she stood up and she went to the microphone in the House of Bishops, you could hear a pin drop. When she spoke, everybody listened. She had that kind of respect and authority in the House of Bishops till the very bitter end. Amazing woman. And so I can't say enough about her. And then, of course, the ordination of LGBTQ. It was never voted on directly. When it happened, it came through the election and consent of Gene Robinson, if you remember. And then subsequently, of course, now has come where now we're, in fact, not only is it legal as far as the country, but also with the church, where we now recognize and allow same-sex marriage and ordination. But that was one of those issues. And I saw a question, I think, I'm pulling it up right now because I think it was apropos. So what happens when a diocese doesn't agree with what the church agrees with? For example, slavery, LGBTQ. That's a perfect example. So you have a situation essentially there where dioceses said we're leaving, where bishops said to the Episcopal Church, we're leaving. Now, that's been debated, obviously, and also been argued in court. And most situations, with the exception of one, it's gone towards the Episcopal Church. The essential argument being made is that you, for all this time, your diocese has acknowledged it's part of a larger church. There are constitution and canons which you've agreed to that say you succeed to the larger. But these dioceses would still leave. So they would refuse to pay. They would refuse to acknowledge the authority. And so that's what they did. Although the Episcopal Church still recognized them, say they're under their authority, they're still part of the Episcopal Church, those dioceses will then essentially act as independents. They won't participate in General Convention. They won't participate in any other councils of the church. They will not give any more of their pledge to the Episcopal Church. So there's not a punishment, because the diocese as an entity always remains, and it becomes a legal question that even the leadership, if the leadership, the bishop and others don't recognize the authority, the issue is still, is it a diocese that is still part of the Episcopal Church? And the church has ruled that it's still a diocese, it's been a diocese, and so ultimately pushes the leadership to make decisions to literally walk away or to renounce their ordination. But most of the time, the way it happens is dioceses just won't contribute to the national church. They won't participate. They won't pay dues, not dues, but their pledge. And then they'll try to actively strip assets to then essentially be completely independent, or try to affiliate with another part of the communion, which hasn't happened other than they said they're affiliated. And then even those churches in other parts of the world haven't had the legal standing to accept that diocese. So a lot of it is this posturing, arguing, making theological statements, but in essence, the instruments and the way in which the church is governed, that diocese is still connected. And so in the case of some, it's literally meant people have left the diocese, the leadership has left the diocese, and there's still been a remnant, and a temporary bishop has come in to oversee and to restore, like South Carolina, as they've worked their way through all the legal. So, and then in the case of, if I commit an act that is counter, so for instance, we consider it to be that essentially I surrender my seat. So if I leave the seat of bishop and say I am not acknowledging the Episcopal Church, the House of Bishops then can in fact take action and discipline and bring me up on charges and essentially then depose me. And then the Episcopal Church will no longer consider me a bishop of the Episcopal Church. So a lot of what happened early on was the presiding Bishop Catherine and then Michael Curry trying to work with those individual dioceses and his leadership to remain, and if not, to try to find ways of separating that allow conscience for people to leave. And then for the Episcopal Church that still represents many who believe in the things the Episcopal Church believes and supports, to remain and still have an active diocese. So it's a lot more complicated, but yet there are mechanisms that hold clergy accountable. And then there's certainly legal sides that talk about property and ownership. Does that help, whoever asked that question? It's complicated, but those are just important highlights. And I'm going to sort of leave it there and kind of stop with sort of those key points. I could go on and on about this, and each of these sections we could spend forever talking about the development of Constitution and canons. We could talk about property matters and how that came to be. We could talk about just the role of bishops within the communion and how that works, and in the Episcopal Church, the shared ministry that we always have between clergy, bishop, and laity. There's so many facets to it, but it's important to understand that we are all shared ministry. No one has one authority over the other. The only difference is ecclesiology. I'm in charge of the affairs of the church. I'm the one that makes determinations about the liturgy and what's allowed and not. I'm supposed to uphold the doctrine, the liturgy. And I'm the one that essentially, clergy represent me, and they are on your churches on my behalf. So any matters of ecclesiology, violations of theology, that is the authority of the bishop. So that's why I can suspend worship. That's why I can issue pastoral directives. I have that kind of authority, but I can't go into a church and say, you will run your church this way and you will do it this way. I can't take over. In the midst of a conflict, I'm invited in to work together. And yet vestries can't fire their priests. Yet I have the ability to work with a church to help if there be tension and if the priest has to leave. So we share these facets together. And that's what makes it wonderful, in my opinion. That's what makes this so great, is that you have just as much say in the church and authority and gifts to bring for this church than I do. We just have different roles.
The only question I got, Bishop Jose, was about South Carolina. And I think you answered it. And I did actually want to make a fun shout out that when Bishop Jose was talking about Samuel Seabury gets a mention in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton. There's actually a Samuel Seabury character who speaks out against the revolution, and it's a reference to what was Bishop Jose mentioned.
Episcopalians and Hamilton. How about that? Of course, many of them were Episcopalians, but anyway, that's another story. Any other questions? Anything you all want to ask? Anything you want to share?
How does a priest get defrocked?
Oh, I love that term, by the way. It's such a Catholic term. The term is deposed in our church, and a priest gets deposed if allegations are brought and they're ultimately found to be true of, and it's all in Title 3 of our canons. There's a thing called the life and work of priests, which defines their obligations. So for instance, violating liturgy, if they continually refuse to use the liturgy of the church, doing things that are, moral inturpitude, stealing money, having an adulterous affair, a variety of sort of those things, and then in a constant violation of the doctrine of the church. So refusing to uphold the teachings, going counter to the teachings. So for instance, a priest gets up and say, I don't believe in the virgin birth. Jesus was not the Son of Man. I mean, sort of heretical claims, things like that. And essentially the way they go, they can come from two directions. They can come from a congregation saying that there's a pattern, and usually there's an investigation. There's a Title 4 in the canons. It's a disciplinary process. There's a process of which I follow. There's an investigation. There's conversation. And ultimately, if the priest chooses to go all the way down the road and there's a case made by what we call the church attorney that represents the diocese, there is a body that would make a determination, a disciplinary board, in which there would be a hearing, just like a trial, and testimony taken and witnesses. And that could be the extreme if it goes all the way to the end and there's actually that trial. The other is if it's of such clear violation that I, along with the investigation, deem it to be so severe that the only choice the priest may have is to resign their order. And often what happens is usually two things. Either the priest resigns early on when an issue has been raised and there's facts and it's proven to be true, or they won't go to the full court and they'll submit to whatever discipline the bishop and the disciplinary board deem necessary. So in some cases, some priests may be put on suspension from the ordained ministry for a year, 2 years, 3 years, counseling, because it just depends on the circumstances. So for instance, if somebody did something and there's discovered that there's an addiction issue, part of the process is to deal with the person and make sure the person is healthy. So we get treatment and help for the priest. And so that's often put in the context of what was the conduct that ultimately led to it. So it's not always so clear cut, but there is a process. And so ultimately a priest, any priest at any time could renounce their orders. Some have done it over protest over the years in the church. And some have said, yeah, I got caught and I don't want to deal with what's ahead of me. And I don't want this information and this being shared with my family and the larger church. And I don't want to go through it. So I'll resign. And then in other cases, it's just that the process bears out that the facts are so strong. And then this body makes a determination and a recommendation to the bishop about what should happen. So you're essentially you're a priest for life till you die. You're a bishop till you die, unless you're, again, deposed and brought up on charges and actually found guilty and deposed, or you resign your order. And you say, I walk away from the church and I renounce my orders. Other than that, it's with you for life.
Any other questions? Is a canon a priest?
Yes.
Depends, right? So sometimes you can have lay canons, and a canon is an assistant to a bishop, or you can be an assistant to a dean at a cathedral. And it's a funny word, and it only has one N. It's not like a boom cannon. It's a canon, like a person. But in this case, I am ordained. Yes, exactly. Not one of those.
These are coasters when I was canon of the ordinary that somebody made for me. So a canon is essentially anybody that works under the authority of a bishop, worked for a bishop, or in the cathedral, because the cathedral is the bishop's seat. The cathedral is my church, and I'm essentially in charge of the cathedral, and I appoint a dean, a priest, to serve as the head of that community. And they do all the day-to-day, they do everything, but it's technically the bishop's seat. So all the staff there who work at the cathedral are all canons. And so Augusta is canon to the ordinary. I'm the ordinary. An ordinary essentially is the church term that means to be one who provides order, a bishop of jurisdiction. And so I'm known as an ordinary, a bishop diocesan. And so she has a specific title in the church, canon to the ordinary, which implies, for people who hear that, she's my chief of staff. So you will have a canon musicianer, or you will have a canon assistant. But canon to the ordinary is a unique title, and that specifically indicates that that is the chief of staff for a bishop.
There was another question, easily answered, but are all deacons ordained? And that answer is yes.
C. And this is what's confusing, and I see that, and I hate this term, but so when you're called to be a priest, our canons say that when a bishop ordains you as a deacon, ordains you to a priest, you get ordained as a deacon first before all orders. You're ordained deacon before you can be a priest or a bishop. And you have to be a deacon for a minimum of 6 months before you can be ordained priest. It's called a transitional diaconate. And it's an aberration. It's something I don't like. And I just tell you, well, it's not heresy. It's just a difference of opinion. And there are bishops who totally disagree with me. In my opinion, if you're called to be a deacon, and if you look at page 855 in our catechism in the Book of Common Prayer, you will see the role of laity, deacon, priests, and bishops. They're all very different. To me, serving 6 months as a deacon before I become priest doesn't do justice to the vocation of deacon. I think it actually is an insult to the ministry and vocation of a deacon. I don't have the gifts to be a deacon. And so this idea that for 6 months we are a deacon, I don't think is fair, because we really don't experience the life of a deacon in 6 months. And I think, like I said, it waters down that unique call of deacons. In my opinion, the time between deacon and priest was longer. It's been shortened over the years. The last iteration was a year, and now it's 6 months. I'm a bishop who believes there should be direct ordination. If you have discerned a call to be a deacon, you should become a deacon. If you ordained a priest, and not this thing of 6 months as a deacon, because again, I just think that's not justice, the diaconate. There are things that deacons do I can't do. And there are things that deacons or priests wouldn't want to do that I do. And there are a lot of things that laity don't want to do that ordained people do. So, I mean, that's the beauty of this church. And so part of the challenge is that how do we uphold the vocation? That's why, as a practice, I ordain the people that are being called and are going to be ordained priests. We have one I see right now on our Zoom, Tony Belhue, who's down in Texas, finishing her last semester of seminary. She's a deacon, and I ordained her before Christmas because one of the things I felt is that at least if I ordain her before her last semester of seminary, she has a field parish, she'll actually get about 6 months of real work as a deacon while she's in seminary and at a field parish. And so instead of waiting for her to finish, because then when I ordain her deacon, if I wait till she graduates, she's going to go to her first church and they know that she's going to be their priest. In 6 months, they know she's going to be their priest. So she really can't live the life of a deacon. So at least I'm trying that so that Tony and others can experience the life of a deacon. But if I had my way, ultimately the church will get rid of that 6 months waiting period. Because here's the thing, by the time you get to be ordained priest, and deacon for that matter, but I mean, by the time you get to be a priest, you've spent at least 2 years discerning, 3 years of seminary. What are we possibly going to learn in 6 months that we didn't learn in 5.5? So I'm one of those few in the church that think that there should be direct ordination to priesthood, and let's continue to value each vocation, the laity, deacons, priests, and bishops, and not water down the diaconate by thinking that 6 months as a deacon is somehow puts you in touch with what deacons do, or that somehow values what they do. So I put a lot of emphasis on caring for the deacons and making sure that their vocation is celebrated because it is a unique one. But yes, deacons, priests, and bishops are all ordained.
And one last question, Bishop Jose.
Sure.
What do you like to see in a new priest coming into the diocese? And this is one of your biggest mission objectives, right?
Yeah. I want any new priest coming in, I want them to head on meet the needs of their community. And I joke and say, I don't want you spending all your time on social media. I want you engaging community. I want you to risk. I want you to go out and dream big. And if you fail big, that's fine. We just go back at it again. I think the only way the church is going to continue to make an impact, and especially now, is if we allow, and as bishops, we really encourage risk-taking. We really encourage priests who think differently, come from different backgrounds, have a very unique background in life, and are really willing to go in and get their hands dirty. Because the world needs truth-telling. The world needs caregivers and people who are passionate about the gospel. People need to be loved and need to hear that they're loved. So I don't need somebody who's going to spend all their time in an office. I don't need somebody who's going to spend all their time defining ministry by social media. I want people who are knocking on doors, getting to know their parishioners, finding out what's happening in the community, and trying to find ways to advance the mission of Christ. I don't care if they're trying to increase their church attendance because we're not paid by the soul. But I truly believe if they're passionate about the gospel, if they're passionate about what they do, growth comes because people will see it and they'll be energized by that person's passions. And so, again, I wasn't elected to be the CEO of American Airlines. I don't get paid for the number of butts and seats. I get paid because of the fact that I believe in Jesus, and I believe what Jesus can do for us. And I believe that what Jesus teaches us is the way we need to live life. And so however we can get it, I want priests to think big and dream big. And so Augusta knows that when I'm looking for clergy, I want those risk takers. I want those people who talk differently. I want those people who have really crazy ideas, as long as Jesus is at the center and they're going to love their communities and they're going to be there at people's bedside. But I want them going out. We're trying this program. I'm not sure it's going to work, but I have a program that I think might work working with people on the street. Do it. Do it. All of us are in the business of risk taking. That's what we signed up for as disciples of Christ. None of this is safe. None of this is predictable, but we're still here, right? Because we believe in something bigger and we believe in caring for the people around us. And so I want people with fire in their bellies for Jesus. I just preached. I'm sorry.
Well, amen to that.
And Tony down there on my screen, she's going to be one of those. She's going to set the world on fire.
Yes, she is.
And then Cynthia Nash next to me,
Woo-hoo!
amazing deacon. I mean, there's some incredible people in this diocese doing amazing things. So yeah, blessings to them, and grateful for them, and grateful for all of you.
All right, Bishop, do you want to bless us out?
Yeah, so on this eve, the day before Ash Wednesday, I invite you all to a Holy Lent. I invite you that we've kind of lived the Lenten journey for a year in so many ways. I want each of you to find something starting tomorrow, a little bit of hope that's going to carry you. And not only a little bit of hope, but I want there to be something that you feel you can latch on to that's going to put fire again in your belly, that's going to give you passion to proclaim the good news. There's so much to proclaim that's good. There's so much work that we need to be done. And I really hope that you take this Lent to find a new way to re-engage yourself in your own faith, but really spend time to figure out, what does it mean for the community you're in? What's the one thing that you feel you're going to be called to do as a disciple of Christ? And so I hope on this eve before we begin the observation of Lent, that you get a wonderful, holy, peaceful rest, secured in the knowledge that God loves you for exactly who you are, and that all will be well, and that as people of God, we will do the hard work. We always have, and we always will. So rest well, be well, and prepare yourselves for the next adventure which awaits us all starting tomorrow. And so with that, the blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be upon you this evening and remain with you always. God love you. God bless you. Take care.
Amen. Bye-bye, everybody.